Hi, I'm Walter Russell Mead at Hudson Institute, and I am here for another conversation in our series on the future of the middle class, this time with Joel Kotkin. And Joel is is the Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University in Orange, California, and Executive Director of the Houston-based Urban Reform Institute. People who know Joel's work know that for many years he's been one of the most interesting and prescient commentators on American economics, social policy, even international relations. And it's good to have you here at Hudson and here for this conversation, Joel.
It's my pleasure.
Today, the sort of basis of our conversation is going to be Joel's latest book, which, if you can see it here, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, a warning to the global middle class. And somehow this book is not the sunny optimism, Joel, for which you've been known for many years. Why the change?
Well, I think the biggest problems that I've seen is, when we go back to when I wrote, for instance, America in 2050, at that stage, we basically were seeing economic growth, population growth that was much stronger than other countries. The political system was always creaking, but it hadn't collapsed the way it has now. And I think the sort of rise of sort of wokeism sort of caught me a little bit by surprise. I knew it was there. I didn't know how far it would go. And then the last part, and the part that really bothers me, and I'm going to be writing a lot about this, is the creation of this new corporate state where essentially the oligarchs and the Wall Street magnates have decided to sign on to a woke agenda and basically creating something that has some more similarities to Mussolini's corporate state, where we have dominant companies who remain dominant, who control their niches for 30, 40 years with unbelievable amounts of power. And we're seeing that now in the pandemic being accelerated as well.
Yeah. You talk. What is this neo-feudalism? I mean, what is that? I've heard of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Now we have neo-feudalism.
Well, basically, I go back to the history of the Middle Ages, and what we have in common with the Middle Ages is a fairly stagnant economy, particularly in the developed world. The developing countries, of course, are having their own issues. Second of all, you have low birth rates. That was also very much or population growth, which was very much a characteristic of the Middle Ages. Dominance by two classes. One, in the Middle Ages, it was the aristocracy. In the current era, I would call it the oligarchs, the tech companies, the Jeff Bezoses of the world, who, really are now astride the world economy at levels of wealth that we really probably have not seen in modern history. And I think there's also been this sort of decline of literacy. That was another part of the Middle Ages, the decline of the middle class, the rise of sort of often irrational theologies, let's say around climate, is certainly one of them, around race, around gender, which are very much like the sort of hysteria that very much shaped the worldview of theologians in the Middle Ages. So there are all these parallels. The aristocrats today are not in chain mail and aren't riding horses with armor. They're wearing hoodies and talking about how woke they are, but they have the same dominance, and that dominance is really has to be challenged and is really not being challenged in a coherent way.
In some ways, what I hear going on in your thought is an echo of the argument between the old left and the new left.
Yes.
Back in the 1960s and 1970s, where the old left was calling for sort of a traditional class analysis, and the new left was moving to feminism and the sort of beginnings of the identity politics that we see today. Is that a fair?
Very fair. In my case, first of all, just in terms of background, my grandfather was a window washer in Manhattan. And, I come more in my family background from the left than from the right. I was brought up very much in the tradition of, let's say, a Hubert Humphrey, somebody who, was a champion, not just of the working class, but of the middle class, of the small shopkeeper. His own background was like that. Pat Brown, this idea that the role of government is to help people become more self-sufficient and to be able to take care of themselves. And unlike conservatives, I don't believe the market is all the solution. I think there is a important role for government. And I find that with the book, a lot of the old left people, my friend John Russo over at Georgetown, even Rich Florida, who blurbed the book, they understand that these class issues are more important. Being hip and cool didn't end up helping the minority populations, and in many ways it hurt them and hurt the poor populations. And this group is focused on what actual impact does policy have on actual people's lives. Can they buy a house? Can they send their kids to a good school? Do they have shorter commutes? Those concerns are very practical, and I think an old line socialist may have different approach than you and I may want, but they're asking the right questions. The new woke left is obsessed not with these issues of people's lives, but with sort of virtue signaling, issues of gender, issues of race, above everything else. So, if I'm Jeff Bezos or I'm an oligarch, hey, I can give Black Lives Matter billions of dollars. It doesn't matter, because as long as they are not able to push a program that expropriates their wealth, this is fine. And so I think that we've seen this transition. Like, for instance, in California now, they're talking about reparations. They're talking about, they're trying to reverse the ban on affirmative action. They're trying to put quotas into everything. They're trying to say any case where African-American or Latino kids don't do as well as white and Asian kids, we have to change the system, instead of figuring out how do we give better instruction and opportunity to those very same Latino and African-American kids. And that's the question we should be asking, not, well, wouldn't it be great if Facebook had 3 more, women of color on the board? Who the hell would that benefit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, home ownership plays a really large role in your analysis. Why is home ownership so important?
Well, I looked into the roots of democracy and Republican institutions, small r Republican institutions, and consistently their roots are a large property owning middle class, or people who in the old days maybe they owned a farm or they owned a small business. And by the way, this goes back to my own background, which is in classical history. The early Greeks, yes, there were many slaves and women couldn't vote and all that, but there was a class of middle income, small property owners. The Roman Republic was built on basically what we might call yeoman farmers. Those are the people who made the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire became inundated with slaves, then the middle class began to fade. And with the fading of the middle class, you always get a move towards centralized authority. Where do I see property ownership coming and playing a positive role in more recent times? The Netherlands, I talk about that quite a bit in the 17th century. Obviously, the US, Canada, Australia, where people who maybe were serfs or at the very bottom of, let's say, English society, then came to America because they could own land. People came from Germany, people came from, My family came from the shtetls in Eastern Europe, where their restrictions on what they could own, what they could do were insane. And they came to the United States to get that. My wife's family came from France and from Poland to Quebec for the same reasons. I think that if you don't have this notion that you can own something and that you have something that commits you to the place you're in, gives you some resources, gives you some investment that may help in the long term, and most importantly, I think it provides the society with some countervailing force to Wall Street and the oligarchs. And what we're seeing now is home ownership beginning to head down, particularly for the young and particularly for minorities, particularly for African Americans. And what's interesting to me is I don't think that the modern left cares about these things. First of all, the modern left doesn't really care about what is happening with people's daily lives. They're more interested in symbolism.
So why is the rate of home ownership going down?
Well, the big issue is high prices in certain parts of the country. Home ownership is not going down across the country. It's going down particularly in New York, in California, where the prices have gotten too high and the wages haven't increased. When you have, let's say here in California, where the price of real estate is growing sometimes 7-8 times faster than incomes, obviously there's a problem. So what's happening particularly here in coastal California, where I live, is we're creating what we call NORCs, naturally occurring retirement communities. Because basically, if you're my age and you live in Orange County and you own a nice house, you're in a nice neighborhood, and you can't beat the weather, why would I move? Why would I go anywhere else? But what that does mean is there isn't an opportunity for that young family. I was able to buy my first house in Hollywood, 1980, for $150,000. That same house would be well over $1 million today. Well, what young person, unless they robbed a bank or have rich parents, could possibly buy something like that? So that's really the issue. And then the big problem is, when we've had these problems before, you go back to World War II, and we had this vast number of people entering the middle class, doing the GI Bill, coming back from the army, desperately seeking out the company of the opposite sex. In those days, that was okay, I guess. And those people were accommodated by an American system based on government incentive and private innovation that built Levittown, built Lakewood, built Foster City, built all these different places. We were able to make an attempt and build a middle-class economy with very affordable housing. The reality is, this is something that I'm working on right now on trying to put a project together on this. We could do that right now. We could build economically and environmentally sustainable, livable communities in the periphery of our major cities. We could provide housing. I was just talking to somebody the other day who says you could build even in Colorado, let's say, houses for $250, for 4-bedroom houses. So we could be able to give the millennial generation, the immigrants and minorities, a chance to be part of America. Instead, what do we have is we have a postmodernist theory which says, well, yes, African Americans and Latinos, and to tell you the truth, Jews as well, were restricted from living in certain places. Therefore, single family homes are racist. Well, I said, well, if they're racist, then why are African Americans and Latinos trying to buy them? The reality is we did have this terrible history that is long in the past. I mean, I live in a fairly prosperous Orange County community, and my neighbors are Mexican. Nobody said you can't come here. The only thing is, can you afford to live here? So what we do is we misplace race, gender issues with what are economic class issues. And if we don't deal with the economic class issues, we will continue to see the reduction of the middle class and the stripping of aspiration from the working class. There, the people who, like my grandparents, worked from the working class to get into the middle class.
So you're saying we should be building sort of new Levitt towns? And if so, where and how?
Well, we know how to do it, by the way. It's being done as we speak, particularly in Texas. We could build communities that have some higher density housing, maybe townhomes or small apartment complexes, but with mostly single family homes. We could put jobs near there. I'll give you a perfect example, and this is why some of the environmental arguments that everybody should live in a dense city are kind of nonsensical. One of the key things is, if you have an area where people want to live and they can also work nearby or work at home, that's the most sustainable strategy you can have. So you take a place like Irvine, where they've built enormous amounts of employment. Irvine residents have a very high proclivity to work at home, and they have the shortest commutes of basically anybody in California. We can build these communities. We're building them in the Woodlands. We're building them in Cinco Ranch. We're building them in North Dallas. We're building them in the outskirts of Denver. This is all possible. We are in a lot of ways, our intellectual classes, and by the way, this includes both the right and the left, act as if we're living in Liechtenstein. Our late colleague Cheryl Schweniger used to always say, "I'd like to take these people who write about how people in America should live in these little places, and when we're flying over Nebraska, which was where he was from, I want to push them out of the plane and say, when you get down to the ground in Nebraska, you'll see how damn big this country really is. Even California, even New York, there's lots of land. There's a lot of places that have depopulated, and we can recreate ourselves. This is what America always has done. So if I have an optimism, we know how to do this."
So why aren't we doing it?
I think there are several interests at bay. There has been a rebellion against suburban development that's been in the intellectual classes at least since the 30s. The ULI started doing pronunciamientos against suburbia in the 1930s. There's a whole school of people, in many ways, I love what Jane Jacobs wrote about cities, but she never got suburbia. She never learned to drive. She, to her, the West Village that she grew up in, which doesn't exist anymore because there aren't many families there, she thought that was an ideal. And I understand that was attractive, but the reality is the almost the entire intellectual profession, the universities, the professors, the media are hostile to suburbia. So that's one big thing. It's
So
almost
why
like,
is that, Joel? I mean, why are they?
well, I think there are a couple of things. There's probably an Oedipal aspect to it. They grew up there and it was their parents' lifestyle, so they have to reject it. There's probably some of that. I think there's some legacy of suburbs as being boring and ethnically homogeneous, which is exactly the opposite. I mean, you want a good Vietnamese meal today, you go either to Arlington or you go here in Orange County, where I think we probably have the best Vietnamese food in the country. It's suburban. What do you think the Vietnamese did? They didn't move to downtown LA. They bought houses in Garden Grove. But this image, sometimes I still write about this, the lily white suburbs. I said, I don't know what suburbs you're talking about. Actually, in many metropolitan areas, Seattle for one, Dallas for another, and increasingly even in Los Angeles, the greatest diversity is in the suburbs. So I think that there's that. Then there's what I call the urban land interest. The people who own the most valuable real estate and don't want to compete with the suburbs for jobs and people. Like, I remember years ago, I did a program with Mort Zuckerman, and I asked Mort, I said, why do you only do San Francisco, Boston, and New York? These are very hard places to do anything. He says, because I have the money and the political influence to get through that process. Any schmuck can compete with me in Houston or Riverside, San Bernardino. So I don't go to those places. So you've got that interest. Then you've got the Greens who basically, don't want people to consume. I mean, now they may consume, but they don't want the average, second generation Hispanic immigrant to buy a house in Riverside. They want them to live in a crowded apartment. And to some extent, the benefit of a crowded apartment, besides maybe that they don't consume much energy, although that's dubious as well, is that they won't have children. And therefore you'll have fewer carbon emitters out there. I mean, think of the kind of life when I read a lot from the British Greens, because the British Greens are crazier, or at least are willing to say crazy things more openly than our more PR conscious Greens. They're talking about a world where we're in a permanent recession. This lockdown is the model for the future. We restrict what people do. We tell them what they can consume, what they can't consume. We know here in California that we will soon be under a regime in water and power where you couldn't have a lawn because you couldn't water it. You couldn't. You better take your showers with your wife, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you better take your showers with your wife because there isn't going to be enough hot water. I mean, we're talking about a regime that really wants to suppress everything that people aspire to. Now, look, we can be smarter about generating energy. We can be more energy efficient. We can have people working at home or working close to home. There are many ways to reduce the GHG, but the way the Greens have pushed it, and I think maybe to their long-term detriment, is basically we're going to tell middle and working class people throughout the industrial world, the high income world, that your quality of life has to decline. No surprise that working class people in many countries besides the United States rebel against that.
So yeah, the Greens seem to come in for a lot of your fire in the book.
Right.
What kind of pushback are you getting from that?
Well, what's really interesting, and it's in a funny way kind of scary, is in the past when I was making these comments about, and now people acknowledge that people want to live in suburbs. I mean, the data is so great, and since the pandemic, it's insane. My brother lives in Westchester. He says every time a house goes up for sale, there's like lines of people who want to buy them. Okay, but in the past, at least they would attack you. Now they ignore you because there is now such a common worldview in the vast majority of the powerful media. They don't have to acknowledge what we do. I mean, it's not just me. It's like, let's say Bjorn Lomborg, who's an environmentalist, admits climate change is an issue, but Bjorn has a different take on things. He's shut it aside. Mike Schellenberger, another longtime environmentalist. And what they do is either you get deplatformed as Mike got, or what they do is they simply ignore that you exist. I'll read a story about energy in California, and you won't find a single skeptic quoted in the stories. Now, I'm going to say, as an old journalist, I was trained that a news reporter's job, more than anything else, is to inform the reader. Today, it's more about how do I get the reader to adopt the narrative that I have embraced. So, like when I worked at the Washington Post many, many years ago, Dick Harwood was my editor, and I wrote a story and I slipped in a little opinion. And Dick wrote on the page, "Nobody gives a crap what you think." That was great training. And even when I write op-eds, I'm always thinking, well, is there another way of looking at this? Am I forgetting something else? Because I learned in studying history that there's never a single causation. Like, let's say the fires in California. Newsom, we call him Governor Preen. Newsom says, oh, it's climate change, and therefore we're going to ban gas-powered cars by 2035. Now, how that helps with fires in the next 15 years, I don't know. But it's unbelievably insane. But the reality is that much of the problem with the fires were policies that he and other progressives had pushed. And it's very clear that that was a major contributing factor. But the media has reported things, particularly the mainstream media, that fits a narrative. Now, I was talking the other day with a friend of mine who's a labor union organizer and is working for Biden. And he says, on the pandemic, the same thing. We're going to push the most hysterical vision of the pandemic to get rid of Trump. Now, look, I think Trump has not handled this well. I think that the pandemic is probably going to be the thing that loses the election for him. But the reality is the media has become such almost a conscious tool of a particular. I open up the New York Times, which I used to have a monthly column. I look it up. I read it like probably a criminologist would read Pravda in the 1980s. Okay, there's some good information here. Now, what does this reveal about what the ruling class thinks? I mean, this is such a, it's so offensive to me. And by the way, it very much follows my medieval idea, where you have to express the right ideas. Theologians at the University of Paris in the 14th century really weren't interested in free speech either.
You talk a lot about the clerisy.
Yes.
Share with our viewers what you mean by that.
Well, the term clerisy was invented by Samuel Coleridge, I believe in the 1830s. But what Coleridge, he talked about the fact that in the past, we had what the first estate in France, which was the Catholic Church. And they had control of education. They had control of culture. They said what you could and could not do, what you could and could not read. Today, the clerisy, as Coleridge described, is much more than just religious leaders. It's university professors. It's the media. It's the scientific establishment. Those represent the clerisy. The clerisy has become very powerful. They have grown in enormous numbers. The number of people working at universities now compared to 20, 30 years ago is much, 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 much larger. They are a kind of a privileged class, kind of the American version of the old Soviet nomenclatura. They've most of them have not been hurt particularly by the pandemic, unlike all the poor schmucks who are running, taco restaurants on Tustin Avenue. So basically what you have is this group. They're in the media, and they're really sort of the opinion shapers, the influencers in the terminology that my 16-year-old would use, the influencers of public policy. And they have grown tremendously. And the pandemic has been manna from heaven for them, because now they found they don't even have to go to the legislature to get anything through. They just say, we have this edict and that edict. I mean, what we're seeing, I'm not necessarily against many of the policies that, for instance, that are being adopted to deal with the pandemic. But don't you think our representatives should at least have some role in this? I mean, just to give you an example, I was just doing some research on a related topic, which is Governor Newsom's decision to get rid of gas-powered cars by 2035. How do you do that as governor? And so I asked a lobbyist, I said, why wasn't this discussed in the legislature? Because he said it would never pass the legislature.
What is his legal basis for that? I have to say, I was wondering when I heard that. Can a governor just do that?
Well, apparently, at least as of now, in states like California, anything related to climate, you could argue anything. I mean, if he wanted to say you can't eat meat for the next 10 years, I don't know who's going to stop it. I mean, the problem is the legislators don't want to live with the consequences of their actions. Now, here in the state of California, we're in a one-party state, completely dominated by Democrats. But if I'm representing a working class district in East LA or the Central Valley, do I really want to say that everybody has to have an electric car by 2035? I run a service station. Maybe I keep my cars for 15, 20 years. I've talked to the truck drivers, predominantly Latino, here in the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. They can't go to electric trucks. They said, what's going to happen is all the business is going to go to Houston and Mexico because, the electric trucks aren't ready and probably aren't going to be ready. But what we do is we don't go through the legislative process. It's going to be very hard to pass a Green New Deal through even a Democratic Congress. But what I can see happening, particularly if Biden, toddles off and we have Harris as president, is what we may very have a situation of say, there's a climate emergency. If we don't do all these things tomorrow, the world will come to an end. Now, the Chinese are building coal plants like they're going out of style, but we're not going to pay attention to that. But what you do is you have, as we've seen in the pandemic, you declare an emergency, which in the case of the pandemic is much more real. You declare an emergency and then say, here are the ways we're going to deal with it. And I don't have to take it to the Congress. I don't have to tell that Democratic congressperson from Western Massachusetts that I banned fracking because I voted for it. It was the president's order that does it. And so what we're seeing is increasingly an imperial presidency where we get to choose a dictator every 4 years.
You're making me think of a radio show I was on years and years ago, and this caller called up, and this is when Paul Volcker was chairman of the Federal Reserve. That's how old I am. And the caller says, did I know that Paul Volcker was a member of the Communist Party? And I said, a little taken aback, I said, no, I actually hadn't heard that about Mr. Volcker. But if it's true, I have some advice for you. What is that? I said, well, if it's that bad, if the communists have already taken over the Federal Reserve, my advice is join the Communist Party while you still can and get a low party number on your card, because it's over. And I'm almost hearing that from you now. They control the media. They control politics. There's nothing to be done.
I didn't say.
Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is, you have to be aware of what's going on. To act as if, dictatorial powers and concentrations of wealth are good things and the reduction of upward mobility are good things. I don't think people would feel that way, but you have to spell out the issues. And by the way, unfortunately, we have people, who are more interested in sort of traditional right-left, which I'm not particularly interested in. I'm trying to say we have a societal crisis. Our essentially middle-class, pluralistic society is being systematically undermined. Now, once you understand that, is there something you can do? Look, right now, about 40% of our electorate is the white working class. That's one group that is not going with this program very much. There are many Latinos and African Americans who know damn well that the direction that the oligarchs are going in isn't good for them. We see this in some sort of resistance to some of these policies from some people from the Democratic side. I think the middle and working classes together could oppose this, and a part of the business community. I find there's a part of the business community, usually privately held, family-owned companies, who still believe in the ideas of competition, and they don't want to have a corporate state. So I think there's a constituency out there. How do we get it mobilized, I think is a real problem. And one of the things I'm very interested in doing is creating some forums where people, let's say from the Industrial Areas Foundation, sit down and talk to, Republican intellectuals about their perspective on the failures of the Democratic Party. Because what's weird is the Democratic Party has now become the party of big money. I mean, overwhelmingly, they're absolutely killing it when it comes to fundraising. And the question is, the Republican Party has to come up with an alternative, because you know what? The corporate types are not going back to the Republican Party. That's over. And the only way that they'll go back to the Republican Party is if the AOCs in the world, send them to the gulag.
Well, so do you see any politicians out there today who are saying interesting things, given your perspective?
Well, I think that certainly Warren, some of the things Warren says are interesting. I mean, I'm so sorry that she got into all the woke bull because her economic message would have been very appealing to lots of people. Um, so I think some of what she said, Sherrod Brown has said some interesting things. Tim Ryan is saying some interesting things. Um, Josh Hawley is saying some interesting things on the Republican side, Marco Rubio. I mean, these class dynamics will create a new political agenda. It's just going to take a little bit of time.
So you think maybe one or both of the big parties has to split, or
Or it has to, in the case of the Republicans, they have got to figure out how to add to the Trumpist base, which has some, unsavory elements. Um, with
wait a minute, are you talking about a basket of deplorables here?
well, there are some unsane. Let's just say there are some, some guy walking through a pandemic without a mask, and which is just rude to people who are wearing them. I think, if people who have views that I on guns that I think go a little bit off the deep end. Be believers in crazy conspiracy theories, but that Trumpian base is also small business, small property owners. What you need to do is add to that millennials and minorities, and that is where the Republican Party is failing. Trump is very unpopular among millennials, and he's relatively unpopular among minorities. You can't be a working class party when by 2030, about half the working class will be Hispanic and Black. You just can't do it.
Well, this sounds like AOC might be the wave of the future then.
Well, the problem with AOC is I know she's got a degree in economics, but I don't know how she possibly got it. Her policies would be a disaster for working class Americans and most middle class Americans too. And I would imagine she would be like, favorable to things like, well, I know she is, like banning fracking or getting rid of airplanes. Well, think about all those people who have lost their jobs, very often unionized people for whom that job at the airport or that job at the airlines or that job at the hotel was really their road out of poverty. And now we're going to close them down. I mean, the energy industry alone is an enormous generator of upper middle class jobs, but also of good paying blue collar jobs. You wipe that out, that's not going to help.
So if you were going to try to put together a political program without talking about parties or politicians, what do you think you should say in order to build the kind of coalition that you're talking about?
Well, I think what you have to say is, look, America is a great country, but it's based on pluralism and economic diversity and the aspiration of entering the middle class. Now, that's very different than the argument that everybody should be the same. It's basically saying, the immigrant family, the poor family, the working class family should have that aspiration, that we should be an aspirational society.
I think programmatically, I mean, you're giving me the mood music, but what's the program?
Okay. One, I think we start with education. We got to move in the exact opposite direction that we're in now, where school is indoctrination. Basically, that's the primary task now, is how to turn out nice little woke kids. The things they learn in school, sometimes you just say, I can't believe that this is what they're teaching.
But how is this a political agenda? How do you pass a law and say teachers can't teach this?
What I'm saying is it's a change in where we allocate educational resources so that they're more focused on skills. Mm-hmm. The funny thing is, you talk to people in the business world, particularly in industrial areas, but in others, they can't find skilled labor. I mean,
So apprenticeships, things like this.
exactly. Many of the things I've observed working in Denmark, I think those are good ideas. Secondly, I think we have to look at an infrastructure program that, you know, fixes, the roads and the basic infrastructure, which some of which is the canals, many of them that are creaking now. That would also provide lots of jobs and training for people for jobs. I think in terms of taxes, I think that we should look at doing what was done during the Reagan era, where we lowered the rate for everybody, and also looked at equalizing capital gains with income. I think it's absurd that rich people can invest money and pay much lower rates than I do. But on the other hand, I don't want people to pay higher rates. So I think we have to look at, and then how do we incentivize companies to locate here, to build plants here? When I discuss what's happening here in California, which is sort of on the cutting edge of neo-feudalism, if you will, one of the things that I said, what a great thing it would be if Elon Musk built his next car plant in South LA or Fresno. It would be a game changer, just like Toyota coming to San Antonio, as Henry Cisneros has talked about, was a game changer for San Antonio, for working class people who now could get good union jobs with health benefits. Those kind of things would be transformative. And I'm not against the idea of providing incentives so companies produce their products here in the United States, in places, there are places in this country like Ohio that have done fairly well with this. I think that we should look at how do we give incentive for people to invest in productive uses in the economy. I think that's really important. Very important. Trade. The big winner of the election could end up being China. And I know you've written a lot about China, and I've spent a lot of time in China. I'm a great admirer of the amazing resiliency and hard work of the Chinese people. I've been going there since the early 80s, and I'm very impressed with that. But we also have to realize the Communist Party has a plan to try to displace the United States as the world's leading economic power. You can't act as if, well, no, they're not a threat, and we don't have to counter what they're doing. Well, that's absurd. And I'm afraid that the corporatists around Biden in particular are going to say, we're not going to fight the Chinese on these issues. As long as we can get our profits out of China, we don't care what happens to the jobs. There has to be a job-centric, upwardly mobile-centric policy. Then on policies like housing, as we talked about, maybe we should think about how we can provide a regulatory environment so developers could go and create these new communities in the periphery of our cities. So, I mean, I think that we have to have a pro-growth, pro-middle and working class policy. Now, I'm not a policy wonk. I have some ideas. I've seen some things in other countries. I think that I've worked a lot with the government in Singapore. They are very concerned about making sure that a large percentage of their population are homeowners. In the case of Singapore, they're apartments. But Lee Kuan Yew was very, very clear about this. He did not want a country dominated by a few real estate interests and with a vast class of renters who would not have a stake in the republic.
Yep. And do you think it's possible, given the media bias and so on, and the sort of power of the corporatists, you think it's possible for a program like this to take power?
Yeah, I do. I think it is possible. I mean, in some ways, you can take some heart, even though he's an ugly, miserable human being. Donald Trump's victory in 2016, it told us that, what, they can't stop certain things, that middle and working class people will rebel against uh, a sense that they're being taken advantage of. So I do think that there is a possibility. What we need is we need somebody who can combine some of the insights that Trump had uh, with a more open and empathetic spirit. I think it's that lack of empathy. I mean, look, President Trump is maybe a jerk, but he's right when he says to African Americans, "What do you have to lose? How well did you do under President Obama? Not very well." Now, the black bourgeoisie, what Du Bois talked about, the top 10%, the talented 10th, they actually did quite well, and they'll do very well. A Black Lives Matter agenda is great for a university educated African American intellectual because it's going to create all sorts of incentives. Is it going to help the people in the South Side of Chicago? I'd like to, when people say, "Oh, the progressives are the key," all I can say is get in a car in Chicago and drive south of the University of Chicago. And if you think that's working, then you're not paying attention to what you're seeing.
Okay. Let's look a little bit outside the United States, because I know you don't think that these problems are confined to the US, and maybe especially sort of Mexico, Central America, Caribbean, because that's right in our neighborhood. What do you see happening there?
Well, I just did a piece for Quillette with a friend from South Africa about what's happening to the developing world, which is, I think, a scandal that has hardly been covered in terms of, we're so obsessed with our own problems, we're not even paying attention. My understanding is Mexico in particular, which is a country that I've spent time in as well. Mexico is being, first of all, hit hard by the pandemic. It's being hit hard because people can't come to the United States. It's being hit hard because the regime has used the pandemic to become more authoritarian. By the way, same pattern in South Africa, same pattern in Brazil, same pattern in other countries, and Iran, of course. And so what we're doing is we're creating a scenario where, why should developing countries endorse a neoliberal regime which offers them no opportunity? So what we've done is if we don't create an opportunity scenario for those countries, I think the world is going to be in a very, very bad place, and we're going to essentially cede the future to China. Because what China can say, you know what, we can send you medical equipment, we can send you medical teams, we can loan you money for whatever boondoggle you want to have. And we're going to bring in, and I've read about this, surveillance equipment so you can survey your people just like we do. And one of the great tragedies of the pandemic is they can claim, now how true it is a different story. They can claim our incredibly militarized repressive policies worked. America's and Britain's and most of Europe's on again, off again policies didn't. Mm-hmm. So I'm very concerned about that. China is a great country, and it is a much more formidable competitor than the Soviet Union ever was.
Well, when you talk about, you give me 2 points here. One is we have to be creating opportunity for countries like Mexico. On the other hand, we have to be encouraging factories and all to be right. Based in the United States. So what are we talking about? Seems like there's a trade-off there, or how do you work on that?
Well, I would argue that, and I made this argument in several articles, which is a strong Mexico is good for us. They buy from us, we buy from them. It is far better for an American company to locate, if they need something for wage reasons, in Mexico than in China, because the supply chain it may still be in the US. The technical assistance will be in the US. Maybe the final assembly will be in the US. You take it to China, it's gone. Right. You're never going to have a piece of it.
On the other hand, though, if we're going to build our alliances in Asia, we have to have supply chains that involve Vietnam and India and so on. I mean, it's, there does seem to be a bit of a contradiction between a bring manufacturing home agenda and cement a world system of alliances and order through trade? How do we think
Well,
about that?
well, first of all, that's something we have to think about. I mean, the libertarian right just said free trade, no restrictions, and we know where that ended up. Then you have the corporatists who say, hey, you know what, we've got a great inside deal in China, so we're going to keep it up. I think, there are going, and I'm working on this right now with our old colleague, Mike Lind. There are sectors of the economy that make sense to relocate here in the US. And there are sectors where, Vietnam or India or Mexico makes sense. What we don't want to do is create in one country, China, a country that does everything soup to nuts and has complete control over the entire process. And we have opportunities there. I have good friends who work in Africa. And what they say is the Chinese presence in Africa is greatly resented because when they bring a plant or they build a project, much of the employment and almost all the high-end employment goes to people from China. Western countries can come in and say, well, of course, we're going to have technical expertise, but we're going to have employment for you as well. I mean, we can't cut ourselves off from the rest of the world, but we have to be infinitely more intelligent about how we approach it. And we have to be much more assertive about what our interests are and what our interests aren't. I mean, during the pandemic, early on, we couldn't get masks. I had to go to a friend who went to her cousin in Shenzhen to send us masks.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that I couldn't go to one of the big American companies and get my masks there shows you that we, on certain things like medical equipment, military equipment, basics like steel, we have to be able to produce that in the United States. It's an absurdity that the rebuilding of the Bay Bridge was done with defective Chinese steel when you had steel plants within 50 to 70 miles of where the bridge was being built. That kind of dependency, even from a national security point of view, has to be considered.
So now that I'm going to ask you the question every author hates. Now that you've finished this book, what's next?
Well, I promised my wife not to write another one for a while, because as she said, on this book, you went into your office and came out 6 months later. I'm getting to a point in my life where the time with my wife and my kids are probably more important to me. So probably not going to write another book for a few years. I also, and Walter, you know this as an author, book writing has become increasingly difficult. It's the big publishers have become increasingly woke themselves. So they publish certain kinds of books more than other kinds of books. Second thing is people don't read. And books seem to be not the way that you communicate. I think like one idea may be that you do more, long papers or pamphlets. And I think that may be more the direction that I'm going to go in, at least in the near future, because book publishing has become so difficult. When I published my first book in 1982. And I'll tell you, the book industry 40 years, almost 40 years later, is a different animal. The money is less, the reading is less, the reaction is less. Even though this book has gotten a lot of attention, and in a lot of countries, it's not the same as it was years ago. The attention to books is much less than it was. And I think people don't have the attention span. I don't know if your experience at Bard is like this, but I used to have 8 books assigned in a semester. I now am down to 4. And I'm not sure that most of those books ever really get read. No, I'll ask specific questions and maybe they'll look for it there. But the idea, when I went to school many years ago, the greatest thing wasn't the professors. It wasn't the other students. It was the books that I was asked to read. That's what stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that's no longer the case. So I'm sure I'll write another book, but probably not for the next 2-3 years.
What about topics? Are there topics you're going to follow?
Well, I think there are some really interesting ones. One, how do we deal with environmental crises or pandemic crises without destroying the economy. I mean, we have to get out of this dichotomy that I see, for instance, on the pandemic, where, well, the only way to be absolutely sure is to lock everybody in their house, have them never do anything, never go out, or restrict them so much that the economy really never returns, except for the upper end, which is what's happened. Same thing with the environment. Do we deal with reducing GHG on the backs of the middle and working class, or do we come up with ways that may be useful? Like, for instance, maybe go from coal to natural gas. That's where you can get your early reductions. We see this with the Port of Los Angeles. We're going to go all electric. We can use recycled natural gas. It's 99% emissions free. Why not do that? It's cheap. It's available. The infrastructure is there. You can build the trucks relatively affordably. So this idea of how do we become resilient? And in terms of climate change, I was interviewed yesterday by a Dutch newspaper, and I am kind of favorable to the Netherlands on a lot of levels. And one of the things that they said, okay, the seas are going to rise. They're always that problem in the Netherlands. So you do something about it. You say, well, we're going to have more droughts, or the weather is going to be less predictable. Then why don't you build more reservoirs for when we have a wet year, so that we have enough water? I mean, didn't anybody besides me read about Joseph in the Bible? I mean, so in other words, how can we be practically able to address pandemic and climate issues without destroying the middle class and without destroying the economy? That's where I think the action is going to be.
All right. Well, listen, this has been a fantastic talk. I look forward to continuing to follow up, and some of the colleagues that you work with are also doing some really interesting things. So I think we'll be having them on as well. And Joel, thanks an awful lot, and really appreciate your work.
That was a great pleasure.
All right.